Tonight, we are going to explore a very slow and boring history. This story is designed to help you relax, unwind, and gently fall asleep. So find a comfortable position, close your eyes, and let's begin. Every year, millions of people walk through Vatican City. They stand beneath the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, necks craned, eyes tracing Michelangelo's outstretched finger of God. They step into St. Peter's Basilica, overwhelmed by the enormity of marble columns and golden light filtering through stained glass. They photograph the Swiss guards in their Renaissance uniforms, standing motionless like painted sentries from another century. The tourists believe they've seen the Vatican. They believe they've witnessed the heart of one of the world's most powerful institutions. But there's a door they'll never see. It exists deep within the Apostolic Palace, unmarked and unadorned. No velvet ropes guide visitors toward it. No plaques explain its significance. The hallway leading to this door is silent in a way that feels deliberate, as if sound itself has been instructed to stay away. The walls are thick, built centuries ago when secrecy required stone and mortar rather than passwords and encryption. This door is not guarded by soldiers. It doesn't need to be. It's guarded by something far more effective: invisibility. Beyond this door lies the Vatican Apostolic Archives, formerly known by a more honest name, the Vatican Secret Archives. The rebranding happened recently, an attempt to soften perception, but the old name lingers because it was always more accurate. This is not a library in any conventional sense. It's not a place where knowledge is shared. It's a place where knowledge is kept. The numbers alone are staggering. 53 miles of shelving stretch through climate-controlled rooms. 35,000 volumes of catalogue attempt to organize 12 centuries of documentation. Papal bulls, ancient manuscripts, diplomatic correspondence, trial records and texts in languages most scholars have never encountered. The oldest document dates back to the 8th century, though whispers suggest there are fragments far older, pieces of parchment that predate the official founding of the archives by centuries. But here's what should trouble you. 53 miles of shelving represents only what they acknowledge. These are the documents they've catalogued, sorted, and stored in a system that can be theoretically accessed by approved researchers after months of applications and security clearances. These are the secrets they're willing to admit exist. What about the texts they don't catalogue? What about knowledge so dangerous, so fundamentally destabilizing, that it can't even be listed in an inventory? Every institution has files within files, secrets within secrets. The Vatican has had 2,000 years to perfect the art of concealment. They've stored documents in unmarked boxes. They've digitized files without making them searchable. They've created categories of information that exist outside the official classification system. The door stands there, silent and final. On one side, tourists wander through Renaissance hallways, believing they've glimpsed the soul of the Catholic Church. On the other side, in rooms where humidity and temperature are monitored more carefully than most hospital operating theatres, the real story of humanity waits in the dark. And it's waiting for a reason. The Vatican archives were officially established in 1612 by Pope Paul V, who decided that the Church's accumulated documents needed proper organization. That's the story they tell. But the collection itself is far older. The hoarding of texts began in the 4th century, when the Catholic Church emerged from persecution and transformed into the dominant spiritual authority of the Roman Empire. With power came a new responsibility: controlling narrative. When Rome fell, literacy collapsed across Western Europe. The 1,000-year period we call the Dark Ages wasn't just dark because of violence and instability. It was dark because knowledge nearly died. But the church survived. In monasteries scattered across the continent, monks copied texts by candlelight. They preserved Latin when most of Europe had forgotten how to read. They maintained libraries when cities were burning. But preservation is never neutral. Every time a monk decided which text to copy and which to let fade into obscurity, he made a choice about what future generations would know. The church didn't just preserve knowledge, they curated it. They decided which classical texts aligned with Christian doctrine and which contradicted it. They copied the works that reinforced their authority and allowed competing perspectives to vanish into ash and decay. Plato was acceptable. Certain plays of Euripides were not. Medical texts from Galen could be saved, but the more controversial anatomical studies were left to rot. Then came the Crusades. When European knights invaded the Holy Land, they didn't just fight, they collected. They looted entire libraries from conquered cities. They seized manuscripts from Islamic scholars who had preserved Greek and Roman knowledge that Europe had lost. Texts on astronomy, mathematics, medicine, and philosophy flowed back to Rome, where church officials examined them carefully. Some were translated and shared with European universities. Others were locked away, deemed too dangerous for general circulation because they contradicted official church positions on the nature of the cosmos or the human body. By the medieval period, the church had become the world's most efficient intelligence network. Every confession was a data collection point. Every monastery was a listening post. Every bishop reported back to Rome. When heretical sects were crushed, their libraries were confiscated. When mystical orders were disbanded, their writings were seized. The Knights Templar, the Cathars, the Gnostics. Entire movements were erased from history, but their texts weren't destroyed. They were archived, studied, hidden. The Vatican created something called the Archivum Secretum, the secret archive, where documents deemed too sensitive for even limited circulation were stored. Not just religious heresies, but political conspiracies, scientific discoveries that challenged doctrine, prophecies that predicted uncomfortable futures, and correspondence that revealed how much earthly power the church wielded behind its spiritual facade. In 1881, Pope Leo III made a calculated decision. He opened a tiny fraction of the archives to select scholars, carefully chosen academics who could be trusted to handle what they found with appropriate discretion. It was a brilliant move. By allowing limited access, the Vatican created the illusion of transparency while maintaining absolute control. Researchers could request specific documents, but only if they already knew those documents existed. The catalogue itself became a filter. You couldn't ask for what you didn't know to look for. Even today, vast sections remain completely off limits. Documents sealed by papal decree can't be requested. Entire collections exist in unmarked storage, accessible only to Vatican officials with clearance levels that have never been publicly explained. The Church didn't just become the keeper of secrets, they became the ultimate gatekeeper, deciding what humanity would be allowed to remember and what would remain locked in climate-controlled darkness, waiting for a day that may never come. 53 miles of shelving. Let that number settle for a moment. If you walked the length of every shelf in the Vatican archives, You'd travel farther than the distance from the Vatican to the coast of Italy, but that measurement only accounts for physical shelving. It doesn't include the thousands of documents stored in archival boxes, stacked floor to ceiling in rooms most researchers will never enter. It doesn't count the rolled scrolls kept in cylindrical containers, some so fragile they can't be unrolled without risking disintegration. And it certainly doesn't account for the digitized files, scanned but never made searchable, existing in encrypted databases that only a handful of Vatican officials can access. The Church has released some documents, carefully and strategically. They've shown the world Michelangelo's personal letters, revealing his complaints about payment and his frustration with papal demands. They've published the trial transcripts of Galileo, the astronomer who dared to suggest the Earth revolved around the sun. They've shared the correspondence of Martin Luther, the monk whose criticisms sparked the Protestant Reformation and split Christianity forever. They've opened the files on the Knights Templar trial, showing how a powerful military order was systematically destroyed. They even released Henry VIII's desperate request for annulment, the letter that led England to break from Rome entirely. These are the safe secrets. These are the revelations they're willing to share after 400, 500, 600 years have passed. Time has stripped these documents of their danger. Everyone involved is dead. The political consequences have faded. The secrets have become history, suitable for academic study and documentary films. But if these are the documents they're willing to release after centuries of silence, what are they keeping permanently sealed? What knowledge is so fundamentally dangerous that even the passage of time won't make it safe to reveal? What texts would still destabilize the Church or the world if they were brought into the light? The Vatican has never published a complete catalogue of their holdings. They've never admitted the full scope of what they possess. When researchers request access, they must specify exactly which document they want to see, which means they must already know it exists. The system is designed to protect secrets within secrets, mysteries wrapped in bureaucracy, and sealed with the authority of papal decree. The archives are vast, but the unknowable portions are vaster still. The Bible, sitting in hotel drawers and church pews across the world, feels eternal, as if it materialized fully formed from divine intention. 4 Gospels: Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. The story of Jesus told in careful harmony, preserved across 2 millennia. But that book, that specific collection of texts, didn't fall from heaven. It was assembled by committees of men in heated rooms, arguing over which writings were sacred and which were dangerous. In 325 AD, Emperor Constantine convened the Council of Nicaea, gathering bishops from across the Christian world to settle theological disputes that threatened to tear the young religion apart. Christianity wasn't unified then. It was wildly diverse, almost unrecognizably so. There were communities who believed Jesus was fully divine, but never truly human. Others believed he was a great teacher, but not the Son of God. Some thought salvation came through secret knowledge. Others insisted it required strict adherence to Jewish law. Each community had its own texts, its own versions of Jesus' words, its own interpretation of what his life and death meant. The councils that followed, Nicaea, Carthage in 397, and others, made decisions. They voted. They debated the authenticity of certain texts based on apostolic authorship, theological consistency, and political usefulness. Some writings made the cut. Others were rejected and labeled apocryphal, a word that sounds mysterious, but simply means hidden away. The bishops ordered these rejected texts destroyed, burned, buried, erased from the historical record so thoroughly that future generations wouldn't even know they existed. Most people assume those orders were carried out completely. They imagine that the alternative gospels, the mystical texts, the writings that portrayed Jesus differently, all vanished into smoke and ash. But that's not what happened. Some monks couldn't bring themselves to destroy sacred writings, even ones condemned as heresy. They hid copies in monastery walls, in sealed jars buried in deserts, in private collections passed down through generations. And the church itself, even as it publicly ordered destruction, quietly confiscated texts and stored them in restricted sections of their growing archives. In 1945, an Egyptian farmer digging near the town of Nag Hammadi unearthed a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound codices. Inside were 52 texts, many of them gospels that had been condemned and supposedly destroyed 16 centuries earlier. The discovery shocked scholars. Here was the Gospel of Thomas, a collection of Jesus' sayings that felt alien and mystical. Here was the Gospel of Philip, which hinted at a sacred relationship between Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Here were creation myths and theological frameworks that contradicted everything the Catholic Church had taught. But here's what should unsettle you. When scholars began translating these Nag Hammadi texts, they found references in early church writings, condemnations by bishops who had clearly read these Gospels and deemed them heretical. Irenaeus, a 2nd century church father, specifically named and criticized several of these texts, which means the church knew about them, which means copies existed in Christian circles for centuries after they were supposedly destroyed, which means the Vatican, with its obsessive preservation of documents, almost certainly possessed versions of these texts long before a farmer in Egypt stumbled upon buried jars. They never mentioned it. They never said, "Yes, we have these alternative gospels in our archives, but we don't consider them authentic." They remained silent, letting the world believe these texts were lost forever, right up until the moment they were independently rediscovered. So here's the question that should keep you awake tonight. The Nag Hammadi library contained 52 texts. How many more are sitting in Vatican storage, still unknown to the outside world? How many gospels, written by early Christians who knew Jesus or knew people who knew him, remain locked away because they contradict the official story? How many versions of Christianity were erased not because they were false, but because they were inconvenient? The Bible, you know, was decided by a vote. The texts that lost didn't vanish. They were hidden. And some of them are still hidden, waiting in climate-controlled darkness, containing versions of the story that would make the familiar Gospels feel like carefully edited propaganda. There's a name that carries the weight of ultimate betrayal: Judas Iscariot, the disciple who sold Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, the man who identified his master with a kiss, turning an act of love into an act of treachery. For 2,000 years, his name has been synonymous with betrayal itself. Parents don't name their children Judas. The word has become a curse. But there's another version of this story, a version where Judas isn't the villain, a version where he's the only disciple who truly understood what Jesus needed him to do. The Gospel of Judas was known to exist because early church fathers condemned it. Irenaeus, writing around 180 AD, called it heresy and warned Christians against reading it. But no copies survived, or so everyone believed. Then, In the 1970s, a papyrus codex surfaced in Egypt, passed through the black market, and eventually landed in the hands of scholars who recognized what they were holding. It took decades to authenticate and translate, but in 2006, the Gospel of Judas was finally published, and it told a story that inverted everything Christianity had taught about its greatest villain. In this text, Jesus pulls Judas aside, away from the other disciples. He tells Judas that he will be hated, that his name will be cursed by all future generations. But this isn't punishment, it's a sacred mission. Jesus explains that someone must betray him so that prophecy can be fulfilled, so that he can be crucified and resurrected, so that salvation can be achieved. And only Judas has the spiritual strength to bear this burden. The text contains a haunting line. Jesus tells Judas, "You will exceed all of them, for you will sacrifice the man that clothes me." Not the body, but the man, the earthly form that contains divine essence. Judas isn't betraying Jesus. He's helping Jesus shed his human shell and ascend to his true nature. The betrayal is an act of love, a necessary sacrifice that Judas must carry out, knowing he'll be remembered as evil incarnate. This changes everything. If Judas acted on Jesus' instructions, then he wasn't weak or greedy. He was the most faithful disciple, the only one trusted with the hardest task. The other disciples misunderstood. They saw betrayal where there was obedience. They hated Judas for doing exactly what Jesus needed him to do. The theological implications are staggering. If this version is true, then Christianity's entire moral framework, the narrative of free will, sin, redemption, and betrayal, collapses into something far more complex and unsettling. It suggests that what we call evil might sometimes be part of a divine plan. It suggests that the person everyone hates might be the person everyone should honor. Now here's the uncomfortable question. Irenaeus condemned this gospel in 180 AD, which means he read it, which means copies were circulating in Christian communities, which means the church knew this alternative narrative existed. And when scholars examined Vatican records after the 2006 publication, they found references suggesting the church possessed fragments, or possibly complete copies of this text for centuries. They never mentioned it. They let the world believe Judas was simply a traitor, nothing more. They built 2,000 years of theology on the foundation of his villainy. And all along, they had a text that told a different story. If they hid this gospel for so long, what else are they hiding? What other figures in Christian history have been misunderstood or deliberately misrepresented? What other texts sit in those 53 miles of shelving, waiting to overturn everything we think we know about the origins of faith? The Gospel of Judas was discovered by accident, found in Egyptian sand, rather than released by Vatican decree. How many more accidents need to happen before we understand the real story? For most of Christian history, Mary Magdalene has been portrayed as a reformed prostitute, a fallen woman saved by Jesus' forgiveness. That story is so embedded in popular consciousness that it feels like biblical truth, but it's not. The idea that Mary was a prostitute was invented by Pope Gregory I in 591 AD, 6 centuries after Jesus' death, as part of a deliberate effort to diminish her significance. The Bible never calls her a prostitute. That was church propaganda, designed to explain away why a woman held such prominence in the earliest Christian communities. Because Mary Magdalene was important, extremely important. The canonical Gospels, the ones that made it into the official Bible, can't erase her completely. She's there at the crucifixion when most male disciples fled, She's the first person to witness the resurrection. Jesus appears to her before he appears to Peter or any of the others. Even the approved texts can't hide that she was central to Jesus' ministry. But there's a gospel that goes further, much further. The Gospel of Mary was discovered in 1896 in Egypt, purchased by a German scholar from an antiquities dealer. It's fragmentary. Large sections are missing. But what remains is extraordinary. The text describes the period after Jesus' resurrection, when the disciples are gathering and trying to understand what they've witnessed. Mary speaks up. She tells them about a vision she received from Jesus, a private revelation containing teachings he never shared with the others. Peter's reaction is immediate and hostile. He asks, in essence, why would the Savior speak to a woman about things he never mentioned to us? Why would he give her knowledge he withheld from his male disciples? Andrew joins him in skepticism, suggesting Mary is making it up. But another disciple, Levi, defends her. He says something the church has spent 2,000 years trying to bury. If the Savior made her worthy, who are you to reject her? Surely the Savior knows her very well. That is why he loved her more than us. Loved her more than us. Not equally, more. The theological implication is explosive. This text suggests that Mary Magdalene wasn't just a follower. She was the primary disciple, the one closest to Jesus, the one who understood his teachings at a level the male disciples couldn't reach. It positions her as a spiritual authority, a teacher who should have led the early church. Instead, the church buried her. They turned her into a prostitute in sermons and art. They removed her from positions of spiritual leadership. They created a doctrine that restricts priesthood and religious authority exclusively to men, claiming it reflects the nature of Jesus' ministry. But if this gospel is accurate, that doctrine is built on erasure. It's built on the deliberate suppression of evidence that women held equal or superior spiritual authority in the earliest days of Christianity. And Mary isn't the only one. There are references in early Christian writings to other female apostles, other women who taught and led communities. The Acts of Paul and Thecla describes a woman who baptized converts. The Gospel of Philip suggests Mary Magdalene was Jesus' partner in a sacred, mystical sense. These texts were condemned, hidden, or destroyed. The question becomes unavoidable. Did the church deliberately erase female spiritual leadership? Did they suppress texts that showed women as teachers, prophets, and equals because those texts threatened a patriarchal power structure? How different would Christianity look today if the Gospel of Mary had been included in the Bible? How different would the world look if 2,000 years of religious doctrine hadn't been built on the systematic silencing of women's voices? These texts exist. Some are in museums now, studied by scholars. But how many more remain in Vatican storage? Still hidden, still suppressed, still waiting for the day when the church decides humanity is ready to know that the story they've been telling was never the whole truth. There's a loss that haunts human history, a wound that never quite healed. The Library of Alexandria, built in the 3rd century BC, stood as the ancient world's greatest repository of knowledge. Scholars estimate it contains somewhere between 400,000 and 1 million scrolls, texts on mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, engineering, poetry, and subjects we don't even have names for anymore. It wasn't just a library. It was the brain of civilization, the place where knowledge from Egypt, Greece, Persia, India, and beyond was collected, translated, and preserved. Then it burned. The traditional story tells us it was destroyed gradually across centuries. Julius Caesar's forces accidentally set fire to ships in Alexandria's harbour in 48 BC, and flames spread to part of the library. Christian mobs, viewing pagan learning as heretical, attacked what remained in the 4th century. Finally, the Arab conquest in the 7th century supposedly finished what earlier destructions had begun. By the medieval period, the Library of Alexandria existed only as a legend, a symbol of everything humanity had lost when the ancient world collapsed. But that story is incomplete. What they don't tell you is that before each destruction, there were rescue efforts. When Caesar's fire started, scholars and collectors rushed to save what they could. When Christian authorities began purging pagan texts, sympathetic monks hid scrolls in monasteries across the Mediterranean. When Constantinople became the new center of learning in the Eastern Roman Empire, many Alexandrian texts were transported there for safekeeping. Then, in 1453, Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Empire. The city was sacked, libraries were looted, but Western collectors had been preparing for this possibility for decades. Merchants, scholars, and agents working for various European powers, including representatives of the Vatican, acquired massive numbers of Greek and Latin manuscripts during the chaos. They paid in gold for texts that would have been destroyed or scattered. They shipped crates of scrolls back to Italy, where they disappeared into private collections and church archives. The Vatican's collection of Greek scientific manuscripts is among the largest in the world. Thousands of texts, many never fully catalogued, sit in temperature-controlled storage. Some have been studied. Most haven't. When researchers request access, they must know which specific document they're looking for, and they must have credentials that satisfy Vatican censure. The casual inquiry is not entertained. The browsing scholar is turned away. Now here's what should trouble you. Many of these Greek manuscripts contain knowledge that predates Christianity. Knowledge that survived the fall of Rome specifically because the Church preserved it. But preserved doesn't mean shared. The Church became the inheritor of ancient learning, the institution that decided which texts would be copied and disseminated, and which would remain locked away. Some of these texts almost certainly came from Alexandria, rescued before the fires, passed through Byzantine hands, and ultimately locked in Vatican storage. They contain astronomical calculations that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries. They describe medical procedures more advanced than anything practiced in medieval Europe. They reference technologies and mathematical concepts that modern scholars, when they've been allowed glimpses, can barely understand. The Library of Alexandria burned, yes, but not everything burned. Some of it was saved. The question is, saved for whom? The Church possessed knowledge from the ancient world that could have accelerated human progress by centuries. They chose not to share it. They chose instead to act as gatekeepers, releasing scraps of information when it suited their purposes, and keeping the rest hidden behind doors no tourist will ever see. What scientific breakthroughs are sitting in those archives, written in ancient Greek on crumbling papyrus, waiting for someone to read them again? Most people know the story of Galileo. In 1633, the astronomer was tried by the Roman Inquisition for heresy. His crime was teaching that Earth orbits the Sun rather than sitting stationary at the center of the universe. The Church forced him to recant. He spent the rest of his life under house arrest. It's presented as a pivotal moment when religious authority collided with scientific truth, when the Church was finally proven wrong by evidence too strong to suppress. But Galileo wasn't the first. Not even close. Nicolaus Copernicus published his heliocentric model in 1543, describing a cosmos where Earth and other planets revolve around the Sun. But he delayed publication until his deathbed, knowing what would happen if church authorities read it while he was still alive. He wasn't being paranoid. He was being realistic. The Church had already established that geocentrism, Earth at the center of everything, was theological doctrine, not just scientific theory. To challenge it was to challenge the entire structure of creation as described in Scripture. Before Copernicus, there were medieval Islamic astronomers whose work hinted at the same conclusion. Al-Biruni, working in the 11th century, calculated Earth's radius with remarkable accuracy and questioned whether Earth truly stood still. Ibn al-Haytham studied optics and planetary motion in ways that suggested the geocentric model didn't match observations. The Church knew about this work. During the Crusades and through diplomatic channels, Islamic scientific texts made their way to Europe. Some were translated and shared with universities. Others were confiscated and archived, deemed too dangerous for general circulation. But even Islamic astronomers weren't the first. In the 3rd century BC, a Greek astronomer named Aristarchus of Samos proposed that Earth orbits the Sun. He calculated relative sizes and distances of celestial bodies. He understood that Earth's motion could explain the apparent movement of stars. His work was known in the ancient world. Other scholars referenced it, argued with it, and ultimately rejected it because it seemed absurd that Earth could be moving without anyone feeling the motion. Only one text by Aristarchus survived to the modern era, and it doesn't contain his heliocentric model. That work was lost. Or so we're told. But here's what historians have pieced together. The Church possessed copies of many Greek astronomical texts that the general public never saw. References in medieval church documents mention writings by Aristarchus that discussed Earth's motion. Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa, in the 15th century, proposed ideas about Earth's movement that seemed to echo Aristarchus almost word for word, suggesting he had access to sources that weren't publicly available. When Galileo was tried, the Inquisition confiscated his papers. Decades of observations, calculations, correspondence with other astronomers, and detailed drawings of what he'd seen through his telescope. These documents are in the Vatican archives. They were sealed for centuries and only partially released in the 1990s. What's in the portion still restricted? What did Galileo discover that remains classified even now? The pattern becomes clear. The Church didn't just oppose heliocentrism when Galileo forced the issue. They had been suppressing this knowledge for over a millennium. They knew Earth orbited the Sun. They had the mathematical proofs. They had correspondence with Islamic scholars who understood planetary motion. They had ancient Greek texts that proposed the correct model of the solar system. But geocentrism placed humanity at the center of creation. It positioned Earth as the stage upon which the drama of salvation played out, with heaven above and hell below, with humanity as God's primary concern. Heliocentrism reduced Earth to one planet among many, orbiting an ordinary star in a vast cosmos. It suggested that maybe humanity wasn't the center of everything. Maybe the universe didn't revolve around us. And if the universe didn't revolve around humanity, then maybe the Church's claim to supreme spiritual authority, its position as the intermediary between God and man, wasn't quite so self-evident. They suppressed the truth for theological reasons, for political reasons, for reasons of power and control. They let humanity believe a lie for over 1,000 years, not because they didn't know better, but because the truth was inconvenient. What other scientific truths are sitting in those archives, still considered too dangerous to reveal? In medieval Europe, disease was understood through the lens of divine punishment. Illness meant you had sinned. Plague was God's judgment. Healing came through prayer, penance, and the intercession of saints. The Church controlled medical practice as thoroughly as it controlled theology. Physicians required church approval. Hospitals were run by religious orders. The dissection of human bodies was forbidden as desecration of God's creation. To cut open a corpse was to violate the vessel that would be resurrected on Judgment Day. But in the Vatican archives, locked away from public access, were medical texts that told a different story. Texts that described the human body as a mechanical system that could be understood through observation and experimentation. Texts that offered treatments based on evidence rather than prayer. The Church possessed the complete works of Hippocrates, the Greek physician who lived in the 5th century BC, and established medicine as a discipline separate from religion. They had the writings of Galen, whose anatomical studies in the 2nd century AD remained the most advanced in history for over 1,000 years. These texts described surgical procedures, removing tumors, repairing injuries, treating infections, with a precision that wouldn't be matched in Christian Europe until the Renaissance. They also possessed texts from the Islamic Golden Age, when scholars in Baghdad, Cairo, and Cordoba advanced medicine far beyond what Europe had achieved. Avicenna's Canon of Medicine, written in the 11th century, was a comprehensive medical encyclopedia covering anatomy, diagnosis, pharmacology, and treatment protocols. Al-Razi wrote about smallpox and measles, distinguishing between diseases that medieval European physicians still couldn't tell apart. Islamic surgeons developed sophisticated instruments and techniques, including early forms of anesthesia using opium and herbal compounds. The Church knew about these texts. Crusaders brought them back from the Holy Land. Scholars in Spain translated them from Arabic into Latin before the Reconquista drove Islamic learning from Europe. Some of this knowledge made it into European medical schools, carefully edited to remove anything that contradicted church doctrine. But the more controversial material, the text that treated disease as natural rather than supernatural, that described human anatomy in ways that contradicted biblical interpretations, that used ingredients condemned as witchcraft, was archived and restricted. Consider what was hidden. There were herbal remedies using plants that grew throughout Europe, plants that could reduce pain, fight infection, and treat chronic conditions. But these same plants appeared in folk medicine, practiced by village healers, usually women, who the Church condemned as witches during the Inquisition. The archive contains trial records of women accused of witchcraft for healing people with herbs. The same herbs described in Greek and Islamic medical texts that Vatican scholars read in private. There were psychological treatments for mental illness, approaches that treated disturbed minds as medical conditions rather than demonic possession. Islamic physicians described melancholia, mania, and various forms of delusion, offering therapies that included calming environments, music, and herbal treatments. Meanwhile, the church performed exorcisms, sometimes torturing the mentally ill to drive out demons that didn't exist. There were texts on hygiene and contagion, concepts that could have saved millions of lives. Islamic physicians understood that disease could spread through contact and contamination. They recommended quarantine, cleaning of wounds, and sanitation practices. When the Black Death arrived in Europe in 1347, killing between 75 and 200 million people, roughly 1/3 of the continent's population, the church had access to medical texts that explained how plague spread and how to reduce transmission. But this knowledge wasn't widely disseminated. Instead, church authorities declared the plague to be God's punishment for sin. They recommended prayer processions, where infected and healthy people gathered in close quarters, accelerating the spread. They blamed Jews and other marginalized groups, leading to massacres that did nothing to stop the disease. How many people died because medical knowledge was restricted? How many children could have been saved by treatments the church possessed, but refused to share? How many women were burned as witches for practicing medicine described in texts sitting on Vatican shelves? The church's justification was consistent. Suffering was spiritually redemptive. Pain brought you closer to God. Disease tested your faith. To seek medical treatment was to reject divine will, to prioritize earthly comfort over heavenly reward. And there was another concern. Medical knowledge empowered lay practitioners. If anyone could learn to treat illness through study and practice, they didn't need clergy. They didn't need the church's monopoly on healing through prayer and saintly intercession. The church also feared knowledge that came from non-Christian sources. Greek medicine was pagan. Islamic medicine was heretical. Even Christian mystics who practiced healing outside church authority were suspect. By restricting medical texts, the church maintained its position as the sole legitimate mediator between the human and divine, the only institution qualified to address suffering. But those texts still exist. Researchers who've been granted limited access describe manuscripts filled with anatomical drawings, surgical techniques, pharmaceutical recipes, and diagnostic methods that were centuries ahead of their time. Most of these texts have never been fully translated or published. They sit in climate-controlled storage, preserved perfectly, their knowledge trapped behind bureaucratic barriers and theological concerns that haven't changed in centuries. The church says they restricted this knowledge to protect people from dangerous ideas. But the real question is simpler and more brutal. How many lives could have been saved if they had shared what they knew? How different would human history look if medical science hadn't been suppressed for 1,000 years in the name of spiritual authority? The cure existed while millions died. It was written down, carefully preserved, and deliberately hidden. That's not protection. That's control. When most people hear the word alchemy, they think of medieval charlatans hunched over bubbling cauldrons, trying to turn lead into gold through mystical nonsense. They think of superstition, of pre-scientific ignorance, of men wasting their lives chasing impossible dreams. That's the story we've been told. Alchemy was primitive chemistry mixed with magical thinking, eventually replaced by real science during the Enlightenment. But that story is incomplete. deliberately incomplete. Isaac Newton, one of history's greatest scientific minds, spent more time on alchemy than he did on physics. His alchemical manuscripts, over 1 million words, remained hidden for centuries because scholars were embarrassed that the father of modern science believed in transmutation. Robert Boyle, who established the foundations of chemistry as we know it, was an alchemist. Roger Bacon, the 13th century Franciscan friar, often called the first scientist, practiced alchemy openly and wrote extensively about it before church authorities imprisoned him. These weren't fools. These were brilliant minds who understood that alchemy was something more complex than the caricature suggests. Yes, alchemists talked about turning lead into gold, but that was symbolic language, code for a deeper process. The real goal was the philosopher's stone, which didn't just transform base metals into precious ones. It represented enlightenment, the perfection of matter and spirit, the key to immortality itself. Alchemists were trying to understand the fundamental nature of reality, to discover the principles that govern transformation at every level: physical, mental, spiritual. And in the process, they made genuine discoveries. Alchemists invented distillation, the process of purifying liquids that's still used in chemistry and medicine today. They developed metallurgical techniques for working with gold, silver, and copper. They discovered chemical reactions and created medicinal compounds that actually worked. They were doing real science, just wrapped in mystical language that made it sound like magic. The church's relationship with alchemy was complicated. Some clergy practiced it in secret, believing it could unlock divine secrets. Others condemned it as heresy, as dabbling in forbidden knowledge that belonged to God alone. But whether they approved or condemned, they preserved alchemical texts. The Vatican archives contain one of the world's largest collections of alchemical manuscripts. Beautifully illuminated books filled with cryptic symbols, elaborate diagrams and recipes written in code. Some of these manuscripts are attributed to legendary figures. Hermes Trismegistus, the mythical Egyptian sage who supposedly possessed all knowledge. Nicolas Flamel, the French scribe who allegedly created the philosopher's stone and lived for centuries. Abraham the Jew, whose Book of Abraham supposedly contained the secret of transmutation. These texts passed through generations of alchemists, copied and recopied, hidden from authorities, and eventually confiscated by the church during various inquisitions and purges. Here's what modern scholars have discovered when they've been allowed to examine the few alchemical texts the Vatican has made public. Beneath the mystical language, there's sophisticated chemical knowledge, formulas that describe actual reactions, processes that work if you decode the symbolic terminology, instructions for creating compounds that have legitimate medical or industrial uses. The symbolism wasn't meaningless decoration. It was encryption, a way of hiding practical knowledge in plain sight so that only the initiated could understand it. Which raises an uncomfortable question. If the texts they've released contain genuine scientific knowledge disguised as mysticism, what's in the manuscripts that remain classified? What discoveries are encoded in symbols and allegories that scholars haven't been allowed to decode? The church classified alchemy as a cult, as dangerous spiritual practice that threatened Christian doctrine. But they preserved these texts more carefully than almost any other category of knowledge. They didn't just confiscate alchemical books. They studied them, catalogued them, and locked them away in the deepest sections of the archives. Why preserve what you condemn? Why keep texts you claim are spiritually dangerous unless you believe there's something real beneath the mysticism? The Vatican has had centuries to examine these manuscripts in private, to test the formulas, to decode the symbols. What did they find? What knowledge are they still sitting on, written in cryptic language by men who claim they were remembering wisdom from before the flood? In 1260, a Franciscan friar named Roger Bacon sat in his cell and wrote about the future. He described ships that would move without sails or oars, powered by mechanical means. He predicted flying machines that would allow men to soar through the air like birds. He envisioned carriages that would travel at incredible speeds without being pulled by horses. He even described a device that would allow people to see events happening far away, transmitted somehow through the air into their homes. Airplanes, motorized ships, automobiles, television. He was describing technologies that wouldn't exist for another 600 years. Technologies that would require scientific understanding and industrial capabilities completely beyond his era. And he wasn't writing fantasy or theological speculation. He was writing with confidence, with specificity, as if he knew these things would exist because he'd seen evidence that they already had. But here's what should trouble you. Bacon didn't claim to be inventing these ideas. He claimed he was rediscovering them. He wrote that the ancients, civilizations that existed before the Great Flood, perhaps Atlantis, perhaps Egypt at the height of its mysterious power, had possessed technological sophistication that was lost in catastrophic events. He believed that fragments of this ancient knowledge had survived in obscure texts, and he'd spent his life tracking them down, piecing together what had been forgotten. Roger Bacon was born in 1214 in England, entered the Franciscan order, and became one of the most learned men of his age. He studied mathematics, optics, astronomy, and languages. He advocated for experimental science centuries before the scientific revolution, arguing that knowledge should be gained through observation and testing rather than pure philosophical reasoning. His major work, the Opus Majus, was sent directly to Pope Clement IV, who seemed intrigued by Bacon's ideas. But Bacon went too far. His later writings became increasingly controversial. He criticized church authorities for suppressing knowledge. He claimed that mathematics and experimental science could reveal truths about God's creation that theology alone couldn't reach. He wrote about alchemy, about the transmutation of matter, about secrets encoded in ancient languages, and most dangerously, he suggested that this knowledge had existed before Christianity, that pagans and pre-flood civilizations had understood things the church didn't. Church authorities arrested him. The exact charges are unclear. The records were confiscated, but he spent years imprisoned, possibly decades. His manuscripts were seized. Some made it into the official archives. Others simply vanished, their existence known only through references in letters and catalogues. When Bacon died around 1294, much of his work had already been scattered, hidden, or destroyed. But some of it survived. And what survived is extraordinary. Bacon described gunpowder with remarkable accuracy, including its explosive properties and military applications, even though gunpowder wouldn't reach Europe for another century. He wrote about the principles of optics in ways that anticipated the invention of telescopes and microscopes. He discussed the possibility of mechanical flight in terms that sound less like medieval fantasy and more like early aeronautical engineering. And throughout his writings, he insisted he wasn't discovering these things for the first time. He referenced ancient sources, texts he claimed to have read or heard about. He mentioned philosophers from Egypt and Babylon who had possessed this knowledge. He wrote as if he was reconstructing a lost technological civilization from fragments and clues. Some historians dismiss this as Bacon trying to give his ideas legitimacy by attributing them to respected ancient authorities. But others have noticed something stranger. Some of his descriptions are too specific, too accurate to be pure imagination. When he describes mechanical devices, he includes details about gears, levers, and power transmission that suggest genuine engineering knowledge. When he predicts future technologies, he doesn't just guess randomly. He describes things that actually became possible once the underlying scientific principles were understood. So here's the question that keeps scholars awake at night. What was Roger Bacon reading? If he had access to lost texts from Alexandria, or older sources that Alexandria itself had preserved, what did those texts contain? Were they descriptions of theoretical devices imagined by ancient philosophers? Or were they records of technologies that actually existed in civilizations we've forgotten? The Vatican confiscated Bacon's personal library along with his manuscripts. They took everything: his notes, his correspondence, his copies of ancient texts. Some of these materials have been examined by authorized researchers. Most haven't. The catalogue entries are vague. The access restrictions are absolute. If Roger Bacon really did have ancient texts describing advanced technology, and if those texts are still in Vatican storage, then the archives contain more than religious documents and medieval philosophy. They contain potential proof that human civilization is far older and more sophisticated than official history acknowledges. They contain the possibility that we've done all of this before, reached technological heights, and then fallen, leaving only scattered fragments for future generations to puzzle over. A medieval friar described the modern world in 1260. He said he was remembering, not inventing. The question isn't whether he was right. The question is, what was he reading? Elizabeth I of England kept a magician at her court. His name was John Dee, and officially he was her advisor on mathematics, navigation, and astronomy. He helped establish the navigational techniques that would make England a global maritime power. He coined the term British Empire and advised on colonial ventures. He was a serious scholar, respected across Europe for his learning. But in private, John Dee was obsessed with angels. He believed that before the Tower of Babel, before humanity's languages were confused and scattered, there was a single perfect language, the language God used to create the universe, the language angels still spoke in heaven. And he believed he could recover it. Dee spent years attempting to communicate with angels through crystal gazing and elaborate magical rituals. He worked with a man named Edward Kelly, a convicted forger who acted as a medium, staring into polished obsidian mirrors and crystal spheres, while Dee recorded what he said. Over hundreds of sessions between 1582 and 1589, they claimed to receive communications from angelic beings who taught them a language they called Enochian, after the biblical prophet Enoch, who was said to have walked with angels. This wasn't random babbling. Enochian is a fully functional language with its own grammar, syntax, and vocabulary. It has verb conjugations. It has a complex alphabet with letters that don't resemble any existing writing system. It has a phonetic structure that sounds deeply alien, harsh, guttural, with combinations of sounds that don't appear in European languages. Linguists who've studied it have noted that its grammatical structure doesn't match English, Latin, Greek, or Hebrew. It's internally consistent but fundamentally different from known language families. Dee believed this was the original language of humanity, preserved by angels, and now revealed to him for a sacred purpose. He meticulously recorded everything in journals, creating elaborate tables, charts, and alphabets. He developed magical systems based on this language, claiming it could be used to command spirits, access hidden knowledge, and even manipulate reality itself. In the 1580s, Dee traveled to Europe. He went to Prague, where he met with Emperor Rudolf II and various European occultists. He went to Italy, and according to some historical accounts, he had meetings with Vatican officials. The nature of these meetings remains unclear. Official records don't exist or haven't been released, but after Dee's death in 1608, many of his manuscripts disappeared. His son reported that some were stolen. Others were purchased by collectors. Rumors circulated that the Vatican had acquired significant portions of his work. For centuries, those rumors seemed like conspiracy theory. Then, in the 1990s, scholars confirmed that the Vatican Library holds at least 3 manuscripts by John Dee. They're catalogued. They're stored in climate-controlled conditions, but their full contents have never been publicly released. Researchers who've requested access have been denied or given only limited viewing under strict supervision. What's in those manuscripts that requires such secrecy? The public portions of Dee's work are strange enough, but what about the sessions he didn't publish? What about the deeper instructions he claimed to receive about how to use this language? Later occultists, including Aleister Crowley in the early 20th century, experimented with Enochian and claimed it was genuinely dangerous. They reported psychological effects from speaking it aloud, altered states of consciousness, disturbing visions, a sense that something was responding to the words. Crowley warned his followers to use it carefully, if at all. Modern linguistic analysis has only deepened the mystery. Enochian doesn't behave like a constructed language created by someone who spoke English. It has features that suggest either extraordinary linguistic sophistication on Dee's part, or genuine derivation from some unknown source. The vocabulary doesn't obviously derive from Hebrew or Latin, despite Dee's deep knowledge of both languages. The grammar follows patterns that wouldn't be fully understood by European linguists until centuries later. So what exactly did Dee and Kelly tap into? Was Enochian a brilliant invention, created by Dee's unconscious mind and channeled through Kelly's trance states? Was it derived from some ancient text Dee had access to, but never acknowledged? Or was it, as Dee insisted, genuinely transmitted by non-human intelligence? The Vatican's possession of Dee's manuscripts suggests they took his work seriously. They didn't dismiss him as a charlatan or madman. They preserved his writings carefully, stored them in restricted sections, and refused to release them, even when the political and religious sensitivities had long since faded. If they believed Dee was simply a delusional occultist, why not prove it by releasing his work and letting scholars demonstrate its falseness? The alternative is more unsettling. What if the church examined Dee's system and found something that worked? What if they tested the language and discovered it produced effects they couldn't explain? What if they concluded that Dee really had discovered or rediscovered something genuine, something that posed theological questions the church couldn't answer? Languages are codes for transmitting meaning. But what if some languages do more than that? What if certain combinations of sounds, spoken with intention, can affect consciousness or reality in ways we don't understand? The Vatican has Dee's complete work. They've had 400 years to study it, test it, and understand it. And they've chosen to keep it locked away, hidden from the world, classified alongside heretical gospels and forbidden sciences. Why keep a magical language secret unless you believe there's genuine magic to it? There's a book that's been studied for over 600 years, examined by the world's greatest cryptographers, analyzed by linguists from every major university, fed into artificial intelligence algorithms designed to crack any code. And despite all of this effort, despite centuries of attempts, no one has ever successfully read a single word. Or at least, that's what they tell us. The Voynich manuscript first appeared in recorded history in 1912, when a rare book dealer named Wilfrid Voynich discovered it in a Jesuit college in Italy. But the manuscript itself is much older. Carbon dating places its creation somewhere between 1404 and 1438. For over 500 years before Voynich found it, this book existed in various collections, passed between scholars and collectors who were fascinated by what they couldn't understand. The manuscript is written in a script that doesn't match any known language. Not Latin, not Greek, not Arabic, not Hebrew, not any European or Asian writing system. The characters are unique, flowing, almost organic in appearance. They're grouped into what appear to be words, and those words form what appear to be sentences and paragraphs. Statistical analysis confirms it has the structure of language, letter frequency distributions, word length patterns, grammatical markers that suggest it's not random gibberish. But what language? No one knows. The illustrations are what make the manuscript truly unsettling. There are botanical sections showing plants that don't exist anywhere on Earth, not variants of known species, not stylized drawings of familiar flowers. Completely alien vegetation with root systems, leaves and blooms that have no correspondence to actual botany. Biologists have spent decades trying to identify even a single plant. They've all failed. There are astronomical diagrams, circular charts filled with symbols, and what might be zodiacal signs. But they don't match any known astronomical system. The number of celestial objects is wrong. The patterns don't correspond to how ancient or medieval scholars understood the cosmos. It's as if the author was describing a different sky. And then there are the figures. Human forms. Mostly women. Bathing in pools of green liquid. They're connected by networks of tubes and vessels, as if the drawings are showing some kind of biological or mystical circulation system. The anatomy is wrong. The proportions are strange. It looks like something glimpsed in a fever dream. Technically precise, but fundamentally alien. Here's where the Vatican connection becomes important. The manuscript was owned by Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, the same emperor who collected alchemical texts and employed John Dee. Rudolph believed the manuscript was written by Roger Bacon, the friar who predicted the future. Whether that's true remains unknown, but it reveals that people in positions of power took this text seriously. They didn't think it was a hoax. They thought it contained real knowledge, just encoded in a system no one could break. After Rudolph's death, the manuscript passed through various hands before ending up with Jesuit scholars. The Jesuits were the intellectual elite of the Catholic Church, trained in languages, mathematics, and cryptography. If anyone could decode the manuscript, it should have been them. They tried. Records indicate they spent decades attempting to crack it. And then, at some point, they gave up and stored it away. But did they really fail? Or did they succeed and decide the contents were too dangerous to reveal? The manuscript sat in Jesuit collections for centuries, accessible only to church scholars. If someone had decoded it during that time, would they have announced it? Or would they have quietly recorded their findings, sealed the documents, and left the world believing the manuscript was still indecipherable? Some researchers believe the manuscript is an elaborate hoax, created in the 15th century as a fake ancient text to be sold to wealthy collectors. But that theory has problems. The time and skill required to create such a sophisticated fake, with consistent internal logic and statistical patterns that mimic real language, seems excessive for a simple con job. And why would someone create botanical illustrations of plants that don't exist? Why invent an entire astronomical system that doesn't match anything? Another theory suggests it's written in a lost language, perhaps from a civilization we've forgotten. Or it's an artificial language, created by its author for reasons we can't understand. Or it's a code so sophisticated that even modern computers can't break it. Or maybe it's exactly what it appears to be. A book of knowledge written for someone else, not for 15th century Europeans, not for 20th century cryptographers, perhaps for someone who hasn't been born yet. Or perhaps for something that isn't human at all. The Voynich manuscript is famous because it's mysterious and beautiful. But there are other texts, less well known, that pose the same fundamental problem. They're written in languages that once meant something, that carried the thoughts and knowledge of entire civilizations. And then those civilizations fell. Their speakers died, and the meaning vanished with them. Take Etruscan. Before Rome became an empire, before it even became a republic, Italy was dominated by the Etruscans. They built cities, created sophisticated art, and developed religious practices that would heavily influence Roman culture. We have thousands of Etruscan inscriptions. We know what many of the words sound like, because we can guess at pronunciation. But we can't read most of it. We've deciphered basic words, numbers, names, a few phrases. But religious texts, historical records, the actual substance of their culture remains locked in a script we can see, but not understand. The Vatican possesses Etruscan documents, acquired from tombs and archaeological sites over centuries. Some are religious texts, prayers or rituals carved into bronze tablets. If we could read them, we'd understand the spiritual worldview of a civilization that shaped Roman religion, which in turn shaped Christianity. But the key is missing. Or is it? What if there's a bilingual text somewhere, an Etruscan Latin Rosetta Stone that could unlock everything? What if the Vatican found one centuries ago during excavations and decided the contents were too sensitive to reveal? Then there's Linear A, the script used by the Minoan civilization on Crete during the Bronze Age. We've deciphered Linear B, a later script used by the Mycenaeans, because we realized it was an early form of Greek. But Linear A predates it, and we have no idea what language it represents. The symbols are clear. The tablets are preserved. We just can't read them. Those tablets contain administrative records, religious dedications, and possibly mythological texts from a civilization that thrived over 3,000 years ago. The Minoans were sophisticated. They built palaces with running water, created stunning frescoes, and traded across the Mediterranean. What did they believe? What stories did they tell? What knowledge did they preserve? It's all there, carved into clay, waiting for someone to remember how to read it. The Vatican has purchased collections from Mediterranean archaeological expeditions for centuries. Tablets, fragments, inscriptions in scripts no one remembers. Some were acquired legally through donations or sales. Others were confiscated from heretical groups during the Inquisition. Groups that claim to possess ancient wisdom, secret knowledge passed down from pre-Christian civilizations. Proto-Elamite is another lost script, used in ancient Iran before any writing system we can read. We have thousands of tablets. We know they're administrative records, probably tracking goods and resources. But we can't decode the actual content. The numerical system is partly understood, but the words remain opaque. Here's the pattern that should concern you. We have texts in multiple dead languages. We know approximately what they are. Religious documents, historical records, astronomical observations. We know they contain knowledge from civilizations that influence the cultures we can read. But we can't access that knowledge because the linguistic key is missing. Or is it missing? Languages don't usually die without leaving traces. There are usually bilingual texts, inscriptions where someone wrote in two languages side by side. There are usually descendant languages that preserve fragments. The Rosetta Stone unlocked Egyptian hieroglyphics because it had the same text in 3 scripts, including Greek. What if the Vatican has similar bilingual texts for some of these lost languages? What if during centuries of archaeological collecting and confiscation from heretical groups, they acquired the keys that could unlock Etruscan religious texts or Linear A administrative records? They'd have good reasons to keep them hidden. Those texts might contradict biblical narratives. They might reveal that Christian practices were borrowed from earlier pagan religions. They might contain knowledge the Church has claimed as its own divine revelation. The languages aren't lost. The speakers are. But their words remain, carved in stone and clay, waiting for someone to remember how to listen. Ancient texts pose one kind of mystery, knowledge from the distant past that we can't access. But the Vatican also possesses something more unsettling: modern prophecies, predictions about the future, written by people the Church considers holy, sealed away not because the language is lost, but because the content is too dangerous to share. The most famous example is the third secret of Fatima. In 1917, 3 shepherd children in Portugal reported seeing the Virgin Mary. During these visions, they claimed Mary revealed three secrets. The first two were released relatively quickly. They predicted World War II and spoke of Russia's role in global affairs. But the third secret was different. It was written down, sealed in an envelope, and locked in the Vatican archives with specific instructions that it could only be opened after 1960. 1960 came and went. The Church remained silent. Decades passed. Speculation grew wild. What was in the third secret that required such secrecy? Some believed it predicted the assassination of a pope. Others thought it foretold the end of the Catholic Church itself. The most dramatic theories suggested it described apocalyptic events, nuclear war, the rise of the Antichrist, the end of the world. Finally, in 2000, the Vatican released what they claimed was the third secret. It described a vision of a pope being killed by soldiers, which the Church interpreted as referring to the 1981 assassination attempt on Pope John Paul II. Case closed. Mystery solved. Except many people, including some Catholic scholars and clergy, don't believe that's the complete text. The released version is too short, too vague, too anticlimactic after decades of absolute secrecy. Sister Lucia, the last surviving witness who wrote down the secret, made comments before her death suggesting the full text was longer and more disturbing than what was published. Cardinal Ratzinger, later Pope Benedict XVI, read the sealed secret in the 1980s, and his reaction reportedly troubled those who saw him emerge from the archives. What did the real third secret say? What prediction was so disturbing that the Church kept it sealed for over 80 years and possibly still hasn't fully revealed it? But Fatima isn't the only sealed prophecy. The Vatican possesses letters from Padre Pio, the 20th century mystic who bore stigmata and reportedly performed miracles. Near the end of his life, he wrote letters to various church officials describing visions of the future. Some of these letters have been released. Others remain sealed. What did Padre Pio see that the Church won't share? Then there are the prophecies of Malachi, supposedly written by a 12th century Irish saint. The prophecies describe every pope from Malachi's time until the end of the world, identifying each with a short Latin phrase. Some of these phrases seem eerily accurate when matched to historical popes. The prophecies predict only a few more popes before a final pontiff called Peter the Roman, after which Rome will be destroyed and the Church will face judgment. Mainstream scholars dismiss the prophecies of Malachi as a 16th century forgery, not actually written by the medieval saint. But the Vatican has never definitively stated whether they possess the original document or explained why these prophecies, if they're obviously fake, continue to circulate and cause concern among the faithful. Here's the pattern. The Church possesses prophetic texts from mystics and visionaries it considers holy. It releases some predictions. The safe ones, the vague ones, the ones that can be reinterpreted to fit whatever happens. But it seals others, keeping them locked away with the same security given to heretical gospels and forbidden sciences. Why keep prophecies secret? If they're false, releasing them would prove they're meaningless when they fail to come true. If they're vague enough to be reinterpreted, they pose no danger. But if they're specific, disturbing, and potentially accurate, they become dangerous. Not because they might be wrong, but because they might be right. What future is described in those sealed documents? What did these mystics see that the church decided humanity isn't ready to know? The church kept records of everything, every arrest, every interrogation, every torture session, every confession extracted under pain, every execution carried out in the name of God. For over 6 centuries, from the medieval period through the 19th century, the Catholic Church operated systematic tribunals across Europe designed to identify and eliminate heresy. They called it the Inquisition, and they documented it with bureaucratic precision that would make modern intelligence agencies envious. Most people have heard of the Spanish Inquisition, which operated from 1478 to 1834. It's become synonymous with religious persecution, torture, and fanaticism, but Spain was just one theatre. There were inquisitions in France, Italy, Portugal, and across Catholic territories. Each maintained its own records, and when these regional offices closed or were absorbed into Vatican authority, their documents were transferred to Rome. The archives contain trial transcripts, witness testimonies, descriptions of torture methods, and final judgments spanning centuries of systematic persecution. In 1998, the Vatican opened portions of the Inquisition records to scholars. It was presented as a gesture of transparency, an acknowledgement of dark history. Researchers gained access to thousands of files, and what they found was both worse and more complex than expected. Yes, there were horrific accounts of torture and execution, but there were also testimonies that revealed the actual beliefs and practices of the accused, voices that had been silenced but not completely erased. Scientists were tried for heresy because their observations contradicted scripture. Galileo is famous, but he wasn't alone. Dozens of natural philosophers, mathematicians, and physicians faced Inquisition tribunals for suggesting that the earth moved, that disease had natural causes, or that biblical chronology might be inaccurate. Their crime wasn't being wrong. Their crime was being right in ways that threatened church authority. Women were accused of witchcraft in staggering numbers. The records show that many of these women were healers, midwives, or herbalists, people who practiced medicine outside church control. Their testimonies, recorded before torture began, describe herbal remedies, psychological counseling techniques, and medical procedures. After torture, these same women confessed to flying on broomsticks, attending demonic Sabbaths, and casting curses. The church accepted the tortured confessions and burned the women alive. But the earlier testimonies remain in the files, documenting medical knowledge that was condemned as demonic simply because it empowered people outside institutional authority. Jews and Muslims who converted to Christianity faced constant suspicion. The Inquisition targeted conversos and moriscos, people who had publicly converted, but were accused of secretly maintaining their original faiths. The evidence was often absurd: refusing to eat pork, lighting candles on Friday evening, or owning books in Hebrew or Arabic. Entire families were arrested based on accusations from neighbors or business rivals. The trials reveal the paranoia of a religious establishment that couldn't tolerate diversity, even in private thought. But here's where the records become something more than a catalogue of atrocities. They contain the full testimonies of heretical groups before those groups were wiped out. The Cathars, a Christian sect that flourished in southern France until they were exterminated in the 13th century, left almost no writings. Everything we know about their beliefs comes from Inquisition records, the Waldensians, the Fraticelli, various mystical movements that offered alternative interpretations of Christianity. They were destroyed so thoroughly that only their interrogation transcripts survive. What did these groups actually believe? What practices did they perform? What texts did they possess? The answers are in the Vatican archives, written in the words of people who knew they were about to die. Some of these testimonies describe rituals the Church found threatening. Others mention ancient texts, secret teachings and knowledge passed down from earlier eras. The inquisitors recorded everything because they needed to identify and eliminate every trace of heresy. The chilling part is the precision. Every torture session was documented. How long, what methods, what the accused said at each stage. Every confession was transcribed, compared to previous testimonies, and analyzed for consistency. Every execution was scheduled, performed according to protocol, and filed away. The Inquisition wasn't chaotic violence. It was systematic elimination of dissent, carried out with forms and procedures and record-keeping that turns human suffering into administrative data. But vast portions of these records remain sealed. The 1998 opening was partial, carefully curated. Researchers can request specific trials if they know which ones to ask for. But browsing is restricted. Entire categories are off limits. Why? What's in the sealed files that's still too sensitive to release? 500 years after the people involved turned to ash, the Church kept records of everyone they killed, which means they kept records of everyone who knew something the Church didn't want spread. Those voices were silenced, but their words remain, locked away, waiting. On Friday, October the 13th, 1307, something unprecedented happened. Across France, in a coordinated operation that must have required months of secret planning, royal soldiers simultaneously arrested hundreds of Knights Templar. These weren't criminals or rebels. They were members of an elite military religious order that had protected Christian pilgrims in the Holy Land for nearly 2 centuries. They were the Church's warriors, the Pope's bankers, and one of the most powerful organizations in medieval Europe. And overnight, they were declared heretics. King Philip IV of France orchestrated the arrests, but he had papal approval from Pope Clement V. The charges were spectacular. The Templars were accused of denying Christ, spitting on the cross during secret initiation ceremonies, worshipping a mysterious idol called Baphomet, and engaging in forbidden rituals that the accusations only hinted at. Under torture, some Templars confessed to these crimes. Others maintained their innocence, even as they were burned alive. Most historians believe the charges were fabricated. Philip was deeply in debt to the Templars, who had essentially become medieval bankers, in addition to their military role. By destroying the order and seizing their assets, he could eliminate his debts and claim their wealth. Pope Clement, politically weak and dependent on French support, went along with it. The confessions obtained through torture were unreliable. The whole thing was a power play, dressed up as religious purification. But there's a mystery the simple explanation doesn't quite cover. The Vatican possesses the complete trial records of the Templar persecution. For 700 years, these documents were sealed, classified as too sensitive for public access. Then, in 2007, the Vatican finally released portions of them. publishing a limited edition book called the Chinon Parchment that contained some of the trial transcripts. What's in the portions still sealed? Why did it take 7 centuries to release even partial records of trials that mainstream history considers politically motivated persecution of innocent men? Here's what made the Templars genuinely threatening, regardless of whether the specific charges were true. They had spent 200 years in the Holy Land, the crossroads of civilizations. They had access to ancient texts, Jewish mystical traditions, Islamic scholarship, and possibly artifacts and knowledge from even earlier eras. Jerusalem sits atop layers of history: Canaanite, Jewish, Roman, early Christian. What might the Templars have found in their excavations beneath Temple Mount, where they established their headquarters? They were also the church's bankers, which meant they knew exactly where money came from and where it went. They knew which church officials were corrupt, which political leaders were being paid off, and what financial arrangements kept the power structure intact. They possessed information that could destroy reputations and destabilize kingdoms. And they had established their own hierarchy, their own initiation rituals, and their own sense of identity separate from both secular and church authority. They answered only to the Pope, but they operated independently, building a network of fortresses, banks, and influence that spanned Europe and the Mediterranean. When the order was destroyed, all of their documents were supposed to be confiscated. Their libraries, their financial records, their ritual manuals, whatever texts they had collected in the Holy Land, everything was seized. Some of it ended up in royal treasuries. Some vanished, possibly hidden by Templars who escaped arrest. And some went to the Vatican archives. What's in those documents that required 700 years of secrecy? If the Templars were simply innocent victims of political persecution, their papers would show it. Banking records, religious devotions, military correspondence, nothing controversial. But if they really had discovered something in Jerusalem, if they really had developed secret knowledge or acquired ancient texts, those documents would be in the archives too. The trial records contain the testimonies of high-ranking Templars interrogated under torture. What did Grand Master Jacques de Molay say before he was burned at the stake? What did other Templar leaders reveal about what they'd found, what they knew, what they'd been initiated into? The Vatican knows. They've had the complete records for 7 centuries. And most of those records are still sealed. Here's a contradiction that should trouble anyone who thinks carefully about it. The Catholic Church has spent 2,000 years condemning magic, executing people accused of witchcraft, and declaring that occult practices are dangerous and demonic. And yet, the Vatican possesses one of the world's largest collections of grimoires, demonology texts, and occult manuscripts. They didn't just confiscate these materials and destroy them. They preserved them, catalogued them, and stored them in secure sections of the archives. Whenever the Inquisition arrested someone accused of witchcraft or sorcery, they confiscated everything: books, amulets, ritual implements, handwritten notes. These items were supposed to be evidence of heresy, but after the trials concluded, after the accused were executed or pardoned, the materials weren't destroyed. They were archived. Century after century, the collection grew. The Vatican's occult library includes grimoires like the Lesser Key of Solomon, a medieval text that provides detailed instructions for summoning and commanding demons. It describes 72 demons, their appearances, their powers, and the specific rituals required to control them. The book includes precise drawings of magical circles, talismans, and symbols that supposedly protect the magician during invocations. There's the Sworn Book of Honorius, a 13th century grimoire that's particularly controversial because it's attributed to Pope Honorius III. Whether he actually wrote it is disputed, but the text claims to reveal divine names and angelic summoning techniques authorized by the Church itself. It blurs the line between acceptable prayer and forbidden magic in ways that made it deeply problematic for religious authorities. The collection contains books on necromancy, communicating with the dead. It includes astrological texts that claim to predict future events based on celestial movements. There are manuscripts on spellcasting, potion making, and ritual practices condemned as witchcraft. And some of these texts were written by clergy themselves, priests and monks who practiced magic in secret, believing it could lead to divine knowledge or hidden truths about creation. The official explanation for why the Church preserved these texts is straightforward. They studied them to better understand and combat heresy. Inquisitors needed to know what accused witches and sorcerers were allegedly doing. Exorcists needed to understand demonic hierarchies to properly cast out demons. The texts were dangerous, yes, but they were educational tools for those authorized to use them. But that explanation only goes so far. The Church has maintained this collection for centuries, long after the Inquisition ended, long after witch trials became historical embarrassment. They continue to restrict access, requiring special permissions that few scholars receive. Why preserve something dangerous if you're not going to use it? And here's the uncomfortable part. The Church still performs exorcisms. They have official protocols, trained exorcists in every diocese, and a formal rite that was updated as recently as 1999. These exorcism manuals contain detailed instructions for identifying demonic possession, specific prayers and rituals for casting out demons, and warnings about how demons behave and respond. If the Church believes demons are real enough to require official procedures, what else in their occult collection might they consider genuinely dangerous rather than merely historical curiosity? There are texts in the Vatican archives that claim to contain working magical systems, rituals that supposedly produce tangible effects. Some were confiscated from people executed for using them. Others were written by scholars the Church respected. The Vatican has had centuries to test these texts privately to determine if any of the claims have merit. What did they discover? What works and what doesn't? What's genuinely dangerous and what's superstition? The world's largest religious institution possesses the world's largest collection of forbidden magic. They've kept it secret, kept it safe, and kept it close. The question isn't why they collected it. The question is why they still have it. Why keep something you claim is evil unless you believe there's power in it worth controlling? The Vatican isn't just a religious institution. For most of its history, it has also been a political power, a sovereign state with diplomatic relationships spanning the globe. Popes didn't just guide souls. They negotiated treaties, mediated conflicts, arranged royal marriages, and excommunicated rulers who defied their authority. And throughout all of this, they maintained correspondence with kings, emperors, dictators, and presidents. Every letter, every telegram, every secret communication was preserved in the archives. These aren't public diplomatic documents. These are private letters, where rulers confessed their fears, revealed their strategies, and asked for guidance or permission to do things they couldn't admit publicly. When Henry VIII wanted to divorce Catherine of Aragon, he wrote pleading letters to the Pope, trying to convince Rome to grant an annulment. The Pope refused, and England broke from the Catholic Church entirely. Those letters are in the archives, showing the private negotiations behind one of history's great religious schisms. When Napoleon Bonaparte crowned himself Emperor of France, he forced Pope Pius VII to attend the ceremony. The relationship between them was tense, complex, and documented in extensive correspondence. Napoleon needed the Church's blessing to legitimize his rule, but he also bullied and manipulated the papacy to serve French interests. The letters reveal how much pressure was applied, what deals were offered, and how the Church navigated its relationship with a man who controlled much of Europe through military force. The 20th century brought even darker complications. The archives contain letters and telegrams from World War II, communications between the Vatican and various governments during the most catastrophic conflict in human history. There are letters from Mussolini, whose fascist government signed the Lateran Treaty with the Vatican in 1929, creating the independent Vatican city-state in exchange for church support. There are documents related to Hitler and Nazi Germany, correspondence that reveals how the Church tried to protect its interests while Europe descended into genocide. Some of this material was released in 2020, but vast portions remain sealed. What's in the letters that can't be made public 80 years after the war ended? What promises were made? What knowledge was shared? What compromises were reached? Then there are the rat lines, the alleged escape routes that helped Nazi war criminals flee to South America after the war. The Vatican has consistently denied official involvement, but rumors have persisted for decades. Were there documents, letters of transit, coded messages, instructions to clergy in certain dioceses that facilitated these escapes? If such documents exist, they would be in the archives, classified under protocols that might never allow their release. The Cold War added another layer of complexity. The Vatican maintained neutrality, which meant both the United States and the Soviet Union treated them as potential allies and potential threats. Both sides shared intelligence. Both sides sought influence. The CIA worked with Vatican networks to support anti-communist movements. The KGB infiltrated the Church, planting agents among clergy to gather information and spread propaganda. The archives contain documentation of these intelligence operations, correspondence between popes and presidents, between Vatican officials and intelligence directors. Here's what makes these political archives especially sensitive. The Vatican's neutrality meant that rulers and governments confessed things to the Pope that they would never put in their own official records. They revealed strategic plans. They admitted to crimes. They sought absolution for actions they couldn't publicly acknowledge. Those confessions were written down, filed away, and preserved. Other governments would pay enormous sums to access these documents, or to ensure they remain hidden. Intelligence agencies would love to know what their Cold War predecessors told the Vatican in private. Modern political leaders would be horrified if certain historical deals came to light, and the Church itself has reasons to keep these letters sealed. They reveal how much earthly power influenced supposedly spiritual decisions, how political calculation shaped religious policy. Kings, dictators, and presidents all confessed their sins to Rome, and Rome documented everything. The question is, what would happen if those confessions were made public? What governments would fall? What historical narratives would collapse? What carefully maintained reputations would be destroyed by their own words, preserved in the archives, waiting in the dark? There's a silence that haunts the Catholic Church, a decision made during humanity's darkest hour that has never been fully explained. Pope Pius XII, who led the Church from 1939 to 1958, never publicly condemned the Holocaust. He never spoke out against the systematic genocide of 6 million Jews, even though he had detailed knowledge of concentration camps, gas chambers, and mass executions. The Church has defended this silence for decades. They argue that a public statement would have endangered Catholics in Nazi-occupied territories, that speaking out would have provoked retaliation without saving lives, and that the Vatican worked behind the scenes to shelter Jews and arrange escapes. Some historians accept these explanations. Others find them inadequate, pointing out that moral leadership sometimes requires public witness, regardless of consequences. The truth is somewhere in the sealed documents. In 2020, after years of pressure from Jewish groups and historians, the Vatican opened portions of Pius XII's archives. What researchers found was both illuminating and troubling. The records show that Pius XII received detailed reports of Nazi atrocities as early as 1942. He knew about mass shootings in Eastern Europe. He knew about deportations to death camps. He knew the scale and systematic nature of the genocide while it was happening. The documents also show that the Vatican did help some Jews escape, providing false papers and sanctuary in church properties. But the efforts were limited, inconsistent, and never publicly acknowledged. The Pope chose quiet diplomacy over public condemnation, and millions died while he remained silent. But here's what still isn't known. Many documents from this period remain sealed. The 2020 opening was partial, carefully controlled. Researchers can request specific files, but they can't browse. They can read letters the Vatican has approved for viewing, but other correspondence remains classified. What's in those sealed documents? Did the Vatican make formal agreements with Nazi Germany to protect church property in exchange for political cooperation? Did they prioritize the safety of Catholic institutions over the lives of Jewish victims? Were there opportunities to save more people that were rejected because the political cost was too high? The documents could answer these questions, or they could reveal that the Church did more than we know, that there were secret operations and rescue efforts that have never been acknowledged. The controversy matters because it's not just about history. It's about the Church's moral authority in the present. The institution that claims to speak for universal ethical principles, that lectures the world on human rights and dignity, was silent during genocide. Understanding why requires access to the complete record, not the sanitized version the Vatican chooses to release. Survivors and their descendants have called for full transparency. Historians have argued that 80 years is more than enough time to declassify wartime documents, but the Vatican maintains control, releasing information on its own timeline, at its own pace, ensuring that the narrative remains manageable. Here's the uncomfortable reality. The Church knew. That's not in dispute anymore. The open documents confirm that Pius XII had detailed, accurate information about the Holocaust while it was happening. The question isn't whether they knew. The question is what they chose to do with that knowledge. Why did they prioritize neutrality over moral witness? Why did they protect church interests instead of speaking out for the victims? And perhaps more troubling, what's in the documents they still won't release? What correspondence? What internal debates? What decisions are still considered too damaging to reveal? The silence continues, decades after the last survivors have died. Because the church still controls the story by controlling access to the evidence. The truth is in those files, waiting to be read. When the Iron Curtain descended across Europe, dividing the continent between communist East and capitalist West, the Vatican found itself in a unique position. The Catholic Church had parishes and clergy behind the Iron Curtain, priests and bishops living under communist regimes that officially suppressed religion. This created an intelligence network more valuable than anything Western spy agencies could establish through conventional means. The CIA recognized this immediately. Beginning in the late 1940s, American intelligence agencies cultivated relationships with Vatican officials. They shared information. They coordinated operations. They used church networks to smuggle dissidents out of Eastern Europe, to gather intelligence on Soviet military capabilities, and to spread anti-communist propaganda. The Vatican, officially neutral, became an active participant in Cold War espionage. But the KGB was playing the same game. Soviet intelligence worked to infiltrate the Vatican, planting agents among clergy, recruiting sympathetic priests, and gathering information on Western contacts with the Church. Some historians believe the KGB successfully placed agents at high levels of Vatican administration, though the full extent of Soviet infiltration remains classified in both Russian and Vatican archives. The documents that do exist tell a remarkable story. The Vatican maintained correspondence with both American presidents and Soviet premiers. They acted as intermediaries in diplomatic crises. They passed messages between enemies who couldn't communicate directly. Pope John Paul II, who became Pope in 1978, was particularly active in Cold War politics. He had grown up in communist Poland and understood the Soviet system intimately. He used his position to support the Solidarity movement, the Polish trade union that challenged communist authority and eventually helped bring down the regime. Some historians argue that John Paul II's role in destabilizing Soviet control of Eastern Europe was as significant as any military or economic pressure from the West. He provided moral legitimacy to resistance movements. He encouraged dissidents. He kept hope alive in populations crushed by authoritarian rule. And he coordinated closely with Western intelligence agencies while doing it. In 1981, someone tried to assassinate him. John Paul II was shot in St. Peter's Square by a Turkish gunman named Mehmet Ali Archer. The Pope survived, and Archer was arrested. But many believe the assassination attempt was orchestrated by Soviet intelligence, punishment for the Pope's support of anti-communist movements. Documents in both Vatican and KGB archives could confirm or refute this, but neither side has released them. The Vatican's Cold War archives contain decades of intelligence operations, diplomatic maneuvering, and secret negotiations. They document how the Church played both sides, maintaining relationships with communist governments while undermining them through covert support for resistance movements. They show how spiritual authority was weaponized for political ends, how religious networks became espionage channels, and they raise uncomfortable questions about the present. If the Vatican operated this way during the Cold War, what intelligence operations are they involved in now? They still have parishes in authoritarian countries, clergy with access to populations and governments that Western intelligence agencies can't reach. They still maintain neutrality, which allows them to communicate with regimes that are otherwise isolated. They still document everything, preserving correspondence and reports that reveal the hidden machinery of global politics. The Cold War ended 30 years ago, but the documents remain largely sealed. The Church says it's protecting diplomatic relationships, maintaining confidentiality, and respecting privacy. But the real reason might be simpler. Those files reveal how much earthly power games influence supposedly spiritual decisions, how politics shaped religion, and how the Church operated as an intelligence service in the name of God. Most modern institutions don't believe in demons. They explain disturbing behavior through psychology, neurology, and mental illness. The Catholic Church does all of that too. But they also maintain something else: an official protocol for demonic possession, trained exorcists in every diocese, and centuries of documented cases where they believe they encountered something that can't be explained by science. The Church takes this seriously. The official rite of exorcism was revised as recently as 1999, updated to reflect modern understanding while maintaining the core rituals developed over centuries. Before an exorcism can be performed, the alleged victim must undergo psychiatric evaluation. The Church wants to rule out schizophrenia, dissociative disorders, epilepsy, and other conditions that can mimic what medieval people might have called possession. Only after medical professionals can't explain the symptoms does the Church consider supernatural causes. Then comes investigation by trained clergy. They look for specific signs that Church doctrine associates with genuine possession rather than mental illness. Does the person speak languages they've never learned? Do they possess knowledge they couldn't possibly have? Do they exhibit superhuman strength or violent reactions to sacred objects? Does their voice change entirely, becoming something that doesn't sound human? These criteria are meant to distinguish between psychological crisis and what the Church considers demonic invasion of the body. If possession is determined, an exorcism is performed according to strict protocols, and everything is documented. The Vatican archives contain exorcism records spanning centuries, descriptions of the possessed individual before and during the ritual, the specific manifestations observed, the prayers and techniques used, and whether the exorcism succeeded or failed. Some cases required dozens of sessions over months or years. Others ended in minutes. And some never ended at all, with the Church concluding that the demon was too powerful to expel, or that the victim died before the ritual could be completed. Father Gabriele Amorth served as the Vatican's chief exorcist from 1986 until his death in 2016. In interviews, he claimed to have performed over 160,000 exorcisms during his career. The number seems impossible until you understand that most exorcisms are brief interventions, prayers of deliverance rather than the dramatic Hollywood version of the ritual. But Amorth also described cases that were exactly as Hollywood depicts: violent physical manifestations, objects moving without contact, voices that didn't belong to the person speaking them, knowledge of hidden things that the possessed individual couldn't possibly know. He stated publicly that the Vatican archives contain far more documented cases than anyone outside the church realizes. Most are never discussed because the church doesn't want to encourage fascination with the demonic or cause public panic. But the documentation exists, preserved with the same bureaucratic precision that the church applies to everything else. Some of these reports describe phenomena that challenge conventional understanding of reality. Levitation, bodies rising off the ground without physical support, superhuman strength, individuals restrained by multiple people who suddenly throw everyone across the room, speaking in dead languages or languages the possessed person was never exposed to, speaking them fluently with proper grammar and accent. And perhaps most disturbing, knowledge of private information about the exorcist or witnesses, things that should be impossible for the possessed person to know. The church's explanation is straightforward. These cases involve demons, fallen angels who retain supernatural knowledge and abilities, and who can invade human consciousness for purposes the church understands as fundamentally evil. The exorcism ritual works because it invokes divine authority through prayer, sacrament, and faith. But here's what should unsettle you regardless of whether you believe in demons. The Vatican documents these cases not as curiosities or ancient superstition, but as ongoing encounters with a real phenomenon. They train new exorcists every year. They update their protocols. They treat this as seriously as any other institutional procedure. If the church is wrong, if these are all cases of mental illness misidentified as possession, then the archives contain centuries of documented medical malpractice, suffering that could have been prevented with proper treatment. But if the church is right, if even a small percentage of these documented cases represent genuine encounters with non-human intelligence, then the archives contain evidence that consciousness can be invaded from outside, that evil has a tangible presence in the world, and that reality is far stranger and more dangerous than materialist science acknowledges. They've documented every encounter for 2,000 years. They believe it's real. The question isn't whether you agree. The question is what it means that such a powerful institution has bet its credibility on the existence of demons. The Catholic Church doesn't declare miracles lightly. When someone claims divine intervention, when witnesses report impossible healings or supernatural events, the Church approaches it with skepticism that would satisfy most scientists. They investigate. They gather evidence. They bring in medical experts, including non-Catholic doctors, and even atheist physicians, to review the case. And they apply criteria so strict that the vast majority of reported miracles are rejected as explainable through natural means. This process exists because the Church needs miracles for canonization. To declare someone a saint, they must demonstrate that the candidate performed miracles after death, evidence that they're in heaven and capable of interceding on behalf of the faithful. Without verified miracles, there's no sainthood. So the investigation process is rigorous because the Church's credibility depends on it. The Vatican archives contain thousands of miracle investigations, medical records showing the condition before and after the alleged miracle, witness testimonies describing what they saw, scientific analyses attempting to explain what happened through conventional means, and final determinations, approved as genuine miracles or rejected as having natural explanations, even if those explanations are uncertain. The approved miracles follow a pattern. The healing must be instantaneous or nearly so. It must be complete, not partial improvement, but total restoration of health. It must be permanent, not temporary relief that later fails. And most importantly, it must be scientifically inexplicable. Medical experts must examine the case and conclude that current understanding of biology and medicine cannot account for what occurred. One famous example is Vittorio Micheli, an Italian soldier whose case was investigated in the 1960s. Micheli was diagnosed with a cancerous tumor that destroyed large portions of his pelvis. The bone was gone, eaten away by malignancy. He made a pilgrimage to Lourdes, the French shrine where millions of Catholics seek healing. Shortly after his visit, the pain decreased. When doctors examined him months later, they found something impossible. The destroyed bone had regenerated. Not scar tissue or partial regrowth, but actual bone reformation in areas where the pelvis had been completely absent. Medical experts reviewed the X-rays and confirmed there was no conventional explanation. The Church declared it a miracle. But here's where the archive becomes more interesting than the approved miracles. For every case the Church verifies as miraculous, there are dozens more that they investigate but ultimately reject. Not because they can explain what happened, but because the healing doesn't meet all the criteria. Maybe it was too gradual. Maybe it was incomplete. Maybe the medical records weren't sufficiently detailed. Or maybe the Church had political or bureaucratic reasons to avoid declaring it miraculous. These rejected but unexplained cases sit in the archives alongside the approved miracles. Cases where terminal cancer vanished overnight, but the Church found some procedural reason to reject the claim. Cases where people declared clinically dead revived with full brain function, something that should be medically impossible after oxygen deprivation, but the circumstances didn't fit the canonical requirements. Cases where multiple witnesses reported the same impossible event, but the Church decided it was better not to make an official determination. Why would the Church document impossibilities and then refuse to acknowledge them? Sometimes it's genuinely about insufficient evidence or alternative explanations that emerge during investigation. But sometimes it seems to be about control. The Church maintains a monopoly on defining the miraculous. If they approve too many miracles, they risk diminishing the significance of sainthood. If they approve the wrong miracles, ones that occur outside Church-sanctioned contexts, or that might empower movements the Vatican doesn't control, they risk theological complications. The archives also contain medical anomalies that the Church investigated but never made public. Cases that were too controversial, too strange, or too threatening to existing doctrine. What happens when someone claims miraculous healing, but the vision they report doesn't align with Catholic theology? What happens when the impossible occurs in a context the Church can't comfortably explain? Father Francois d'Hermine, an exorcist and theology professor, once stated that the Church possesses documentation of phenomena that challenge fundamental assumptions about the relationship between consciousness, matter, and divine intervention. Cases where prayer or faith seem to alter physical reality in ways that shouldn't be possible. Cases where the impossible became real, witnessed and documented, but never shared because the implications were too unsettling. If these records are accurate, if even a fraction of the documented cases represent genuine impossibilities, then the Vatican archives contain proof that reality is more flexible than we believe. that consciousness can affect matter, that healing can occur through mechanisms science doesn't understand, that the impossible happens regularly, witnessed and recorded, but hidden from public view. They've documented healings that defy medical explanation. They've applied rigorous scientific standards. They've verified impossibilities. And then they locked most of it away, releasing only the cases that fit comfortably within existing doctrine. The question is, what didn't they want us to see? What other impossibilities are documented in those files, waiting in the dark? The Vatican operates one of the world's oldest astronomical research institutions. The Vatican Observatory has been studying the cosmos since 1582, staffed by Jesuit priests who are also trained astronomers and astrophysicists. They operate telescopes, publish scientific papers, and collaborate with secular astronomical organizations. On the surface, this seems like simple pursuit of knowledge about God's creation. But the Church's interest in the skies goes deeper than most people realize. In 2008, Father José Funes, the Vatican's chief astronomer at the time, made a surprising public statement. He said that belief in extraterrestrial life doesn't contradict Catholic faith. If intelligent beings exist elsewhere in the universe, they would still be part of God's creation. The statement received significant media attention because it suggested the Vatican had thought seriously about the theological implications of contact with non-human intelligence. But that wasn't a new discussion. The Church has been quietly considering these questions for decades, possibly centuries. The archives contain correspondence between Vatican officials and government agencies regarding unexplained aerial phenomena. During the 20th century, when UFO sightings increased dramatically, the Church maintained files on reports that occurred near religious sites or during religious events. The most famous example is the miracle of the sun at Fatima in 1917. Thousands of witnesses reported seeing the sun dance in the sky, change colors, and appear to plunge toward Earth before returning to its normal position. The Catholic Church declared it a miracle, evidence of the Virgin Mary's presence during the apparitions to the three shepherd children. But some researchers, including a few within the Church, have quietly suggested alternative explanations. The descriptions from witnesses, a spinning disc, unusual lights, erratic movement, sound remarkably similar to UFO reports from later decades. What if the Church investigated this possibility? What if they have documents analyzing whether the Fatima event was divine miracle, mass hallucination, or something else entirely? Those files would be classified, too sensitive to release, because they would undermine the miracle's status as Church-approved supernatural event. The Vatican has also held private conferences on astrobiology, the search for extraterrestrial life, and the theological questions that would arise from contact. These aren't public events. They're closed-door meetings where Church scholars, scientists, and theologians discuss scenarios that most people assume the Church would reject. What if we receive messages from space? What if we discover microbial life on Mars or Europa? What if we make contact with intelligent civilizations more advanced than humanity? The theological implications are staggering. Christianity teaches that humans are made in God's image, that Earth is the stage for the drama of salvation, and that Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection redeemed humanity. But what happens if humanity isn't unique? What if there are countless other intelligent species across the universe? Did Christ's sacrifice apply to them? Are there other incarnations on other worlds? Or does the existence of aliens fundamentally challenge the narrative that places humanity at the center of God's concern? The Church would have every reason to classify any evidence or serious investigation of extraterrestrial intelligence, not because they're hiding little green men in the Vatican basement, but because the questions are theologically dangerous. If they possess documents, reports from clergy about unusual sightings, correspondence with government officials about UFO phenomena, internal theological analyses of what extraterrestrial contact would mean for Christian doctrine, those documents would challenge fundamental beliefs that billions of people hold. There's also the question of historical interpretation. Angels and demons are described in biblical and church texts as non-human intelligences, with abilities beyond human understanding. They appear, deliver messages, perform actions that seem to violate physical laws. What if some of these encounters, documented in religious texts and preserved in church records, were misinterpreted? What if some angelic appearances were actually extraterrestrial contact, understood through the only framework available to people at the time? The Church couldn't publicly suggest this without undermining centuries of theological tradition, but they could investigate privately, documenting cases and analyzing whether some historical miracles or demonic encounters fit better as evidence of non-human intelligence from space rather than divine or infernal realms. The Vatican watches the skies with sophisticated equipment. They think seriously about life beyond Earth. They've prepared theological responses for scenarios most religious institutions refuse to consider, and they maintain archives that may contain evidence or analysis of phenomena that challenge humanity's understanding of our place in the cosmos. What do they know? What have they documented? What conclusions have they reached about whether we're alone? The answers might be sitting in the archives, classified alongside forbidden gospels and political secrets, waiting for the day when the Church decides humanity is ready to know that we were never the only children of creation. The Vatican has an official position on why the archives remain restricted. When questioned about secrecy, when pressed by scholars and historians demanding greater access, Church officials offer explanations that sound reasonable, even responsible. They're protecting fragile documents. They're respecting privacy. They're maintaining diplomatic relationships. These aren't lies exactly. They're partial truths, carefully selected justifications that avoid discussing the deeper reasons. Start with preservation. Many documents in the archives are genuinely fragile. Parchment crumbles. Ink fades. Handling accelerates deterioration. The oldest texts are kept in climate-controlled rooms, where temperature and humidity are monitored constantly. Exposing these documents to frequent examination would damage them irreparably. So access is restricted to qualified researchers who know how to handle delicate materials, and even they must submit detailed proposals explaining exactly what they need to see and why. This explanation makes sense until you realize that modern technology solves the preservation problem. Documents can be digitized, photographed in high resolution, and made available online without anyone touching the originals. The Vatican has digitized portions of the archives, but they haven't made most of it publicly searchable. The preservation argument explains restricted physical access. It doesn't explain why digitized materials remain classified. Then there's privacy. The Church argues that some documents contain confessions, personal correspondence, or sensitive information about living people or their recent descendants. Canon law mandates that these materials remain sealed for 75 years after the death of everyone involved. This protects individuals from having their private struggles, their sins confessed to priests, or their confidential communications exposed to public scrutiny. Again, this sounds reasonable, but the 75-year rule doesn't explain documents that remain sealed centuries after everyone involved has died. The Templar trials happened in the 14th century. The participants have been dead for 700 years. Yet portions of those records were only partially released in 2007, and significant sections remain restricted. Privacy can't be the concern when entire civilizations have risen and fallen since the documents were created. Diplomatic sensitivity is the third justification. The Vatican maintains relationships with governments around the world. Releasing certain political correspondence could damage those relationships, reveal intelligence sources, or complicate ongoing negotiations. This explanation has merit in the short term. World War II documents contain information about living political institutions, intelligence operations that have modern consequences, and deals that current governments might prefer remain unknown. But diplomatic sensitivity, like privacy, has a shelf life. Eventually, political contexts change so dramatically that historical documents lose their power to cause genuine harm. Yet the Vatican continues to restrict access long after the political situations have transformed beyond recognition. The Church has made gestures toward transparency. In 1881, Pope Leo XIII opened limited portions of the archives to select scholars, ending centuries of absolute secrecy. In 2019, the institution was officially renamed from the Vatican Secret Archives to the Vatican Apostolic Archives, a rebranding meant to sound less conspiratorial. In 2020, portions of Pope Pius XII's papers were released, allowing researchers to finally examine the Church's World War II conduct in greater detail. These openings are presented as proof of the Church's commitment to historical transparency. But notice the pattern. Access is always partial. Release is always delayed by decades or centuries. The Vatican decides what scholars can see, when they can see it, and under what conditions. Even when documents are technically available, researchers must know exactly what to request. They can't browse. They can't discover. They can only examine what they already know exists. The official explanations, preservation, privacy, diplomatic sensitivity, aren't entirely false, but they don't fully account for why some secrets remain locked away for 2,000 years, why documents are released only when everyone involved is safely dead, and why the Church maintains absolute control over what humanity is allowed to know about its own history. Strip away the diplomatic language and the official justifications, and a simpler pattern emerges. The Vatican controls information because information is power. For 2,000 years, the Catholic Church has positioned itself as the sole legitimate interpreter of divine truth, the exclusive mediator between humanity and God, and the ultimate authority on moral and spiritual questions. Any document that challenges this position threatens the foundation of their institutional power. Look at what gets suppressed. Alternative gospels that suggest women held equal spiritual authority in early Christianity remain hidden or released only after centuries of delay, long after the patriarchal structure of church hierarchy has become thoroughly entrenched. Scientific texts that contradict biblical literalism are kept secret until external discoveries make suppression impossible. And even then, the Church releases them grudgingly, framing their eventual acceptance as magnanimous recognition of truth rather than admission of error. Political documents that reveal corruption, collaboration with oppressive regimes, or morally questionable decisions are sealed until everyone involved is dead, until the political consequences have evaporated, until the revelations can be absorbed as unfortunate historical complexity rather than active scandal. The Church doesn't release documents when truth demands it. They release documents when revelation no longer threatens their authority. This pattern isn't unique to the Catholic Church. Every institution with power protects its legitimacy by controlling information. Governments classify documents that would embarrass current administrations. Corporations suppress research that would damage their products. Academic institutions bury studies that contradict prevailing theories. The Vatican is simply the oldest, most successful example of this universal institutional behavior. But the Vatican's information control is unique in scale and duration. They've been doing this for 2 millennia. They accumulated documents during periods when they were essentially the only institution preserving written records. They positioned themselves as the inheritors of Roman administrative efficiency, Christian spiritual authority, and classical learning. They became the repository of everything: religious doctrine, scientific knowledge, political correspondence, historical records, and they used that position to shape what humanity believed about reality itself. For most of Christian history, this control was nearly absolute. The Church decided what books were copied, what texts were translated, what knowledge was taught in universities. They determined which historical events were recorded and how they were interpreted. They controlled literacy itself, with monasteries serving as the primary centers of reading and writing. If the Church said something was true, most people had no way to verify or challenge it. The printing press began eroding this monopoly. Suddenly, ideas could spread without Church approval. The scientific revolution accelerated the process, providing evidence-based methods for understanding reality that didn't require religious authority. The Reformation shattered Christian unity, creating competing interpretations of Scripture and doctrine. And the Internet has nearly completed the transformation, making information accessible to anyone with a connection. But the archives remain. They're the last stronghold of the Church's information monopoly, the final collection of documents where the Vatican maintains absolute control over access and interpretation. They can't stop scholars from publishing research or people from sharing ideas online, but they can control who sees the original sources, who gets to examine the primary documents, who has access to the evidence that could confirm or refute historical claims about what the Church knew, what they did, and why. This control has been effective. The Vatican has successfully shaped mainstream understanding of Christian origins, Church history, and the relationship between faith and science. Alternative narratives exist, but they're marginalized as conspiracy theories or fringe scholarship because they can't be definitively proven without access to the sealed documents. The question becomes unavoidable. What would happen if everything was released tomorrow? If every document in those 53 miles of shelving was digitized and made publicly searchable? Would Christianity survive complete transparency? Would the Church's moral authority withstand full disclosure of its political machinations, its suppression of inconvenient truths, and its historical compromises? Information is power. The Vatican has controlled information for 2,000 years, but that control is slipping, gradually. inevitably. The era of absolute institutional information monopoly is ending, and the Church knows it. But there's a third possibility, one more troubling than simple preservation or calculated power politics. What if some of what's hidden is genuinely dangerous? Not to the Church's authority, but to human understanding of reality itself. What if the Vatican isn't just protecting its power, but protecting humanity from knowledge we lack the wisdom to handle? Consider the Voynich manuscript. If it's not a hoax, if it actually contains working instructions for something, say a biological process that could be weaponized, or a psychological technique that could be used for mass manipulation, or principles of physics that our current science isn't equipped to safely explore, would you want that information publicly available? In an age where anyone can access knowledge online, where instructions for building weapons or synthesizing dangerous compounds spread instantly, maybe some texts really should remain locked away. Or consider the exorcism records. If they're accurate, if they document genuine cases where consciousness was invaded by external entities, that challenges fundamental assumptions about the nature of mind, free will, and mental illness, how would society process that information? How would it affect our approach to psychology, to law, to the concept of personal responsibility? Maybe the Church keeps these records sealed, not to maintain theological monopoly, but because the implications are destabilizing. The ancient scientific texts pose similar questions. If lost civilizations really did possess advanced technology, and if they were destroyed, whether by natural catastrophe or by misuse of that technology, maybe there were good reasons why that knowledge was lost. Maybe some discoveries come with consequences that outweigh their benefits. Maybe the Vatican, after centuries of examining these texts, concluded that humanity isn't ready to rediscover certain capabilities. This is the strongest possible justification for secrecy. The Church positions itself as custodian of dangerous knowledge, the guardian that stands between humanity and information that could cause genuine harm. They've had 2,000 years to study these documents, to test claims, to understand implications. If they've concluded that some knowledge needs to remain restricted, perhaps they have good reasons. But here's the problem with that argument. Who gave them the right to decide? Who appointed the Catholic Church as the sole judge of what humanity is mature enough to know, even if their concerns are legitimate, even if some of these texts really are dangerous? The decision about what knowledge is too risky shouldn't rest with a single institution answerable to no external authority. The Church might argue that they're uniquely qualified. They have the historical perspective, the scholarly resources, and the moral framework to make these decisions responsibly. But that's self-serving logic. Every institution with power believes it's uniquely qualified to exercise that power. Every authority believes it knows better than the people it governs. Is there such a thing as forbidden knowledge? Are there truths that humanity genuinely shouldn't possess? Or is the real danger allowing any institution, religious, governmental, or corporate, to control what we're allowed to learn? History suggests that suppressing knowledge rarely makes society safer. It just makes society more controllable. Maybe the Vatican is protecting us from dangerous truths. Or maybe they're just protecting their power to decide what we're allowed to know. The only way to find out is to open the archives completely. And that's precisely what they refuse to do. Step back from the specific documents and look at the pattern. Across centuries, across categories, across every type of knowledge we've explored, the same structures repeat. Texts that empower individuals are suppressed. Knowledge from marginalized groups, women, non-Christians, heretics, indigenous peoples, is erased or hidden. Scientific discoveries that challenge religious authority are resisted until resistance becomes impossible. Political actions that reveal corruption are sealed until everyone involved is safely dead. Phenomena that suggest reality is stranger than official narratives allow are classified and forgotten. This isn't random, it's systematic. Throughout human history, those who control information have shaped what societies believe about reality, morality, and possibility. The Vatican is simply the longest-running, most successful example of this universal pattern. They've been doing it for 2,000 years, accumulating knowledge while carefully curating what the rest of humanity is allowed to know. But this pattern isn't unique to religious institutions. Governments classify documents that would embarrass current regimes or reveal intelligence operations. Corporations suppress research that would damage their products or their profits. Academic institutions resist paradigm shifts that would undermine established theories and the careers built on them. Institutions of all kinds protect their legitimacy and authority by controlling the narrative, by deciding what counts as legitimate knowledge and what gets dismissed as conspiracy, heresy, or fringe belief. What makes the Vatican unique is the scale and duration. They've been accumulating documents since the 4th century. They've survived the fall of empires, the rise of nation-states, the scientific revolution, the Enlightenment, and the information age. They've adapted their methods of control as technology changed. But the fundamental strategy remained constant. Preserve everything, reveal nothing unless forced, and maintain absolute authority over what gets released when. This control shaped civilization. For most of Christian history, the Church determined what people believed about human origins, the structure of the cosmos, the nature of disease, the role of women, the possibility of salvation. They controlled literacy, education, and access to texts. If the Church said something was true, most people had no way to verify it independently. If they said something was heresy, it was erased from public consciousness. But something fundamental is changing. The printing press began the erosion of information monopoly. 5 centuries ago, the scientific revolution provided evidence-based methods that didn't require religious authority. The internet accelerated the process exponentially, making information accessible to anyone with a connection. Now we have leaked documents, whistleblowers, freedom of information laws, and global pressure for transparency. The Vatican archives remain closed, yes, but we know what's in them, broadly speaking. We know about the forbidden Gospels, because they were discovered independently in Egypt. We know about the Inquisition records because scholars were finally granted partial access. We know about the Church's political dealings because some documents were released and others were leaked. The system of total information control is cracking. This is the historical moment we're living through. The era when institutions could maintain absolute secrecy about their activities, their knowledge, and their decision-making is ending. Not quickly, not easily, but inevitably. Information wants to be free, as the saying goes, not because of some mystical property, but because the cost of copying and distributing information has dropped nearly to zero. The Vatican can still control physical access to the archives, They can still decide when to release documents and how to frame them, but they can't stop the larger pattern of information liberation. Every generation trusts institutional authority less than the previous one. Every decade brings new technology that makes secrets harder to keep. Every year, more people demand transparency from institutions that have operated in darkness for centuries. We're watching the end of secret knowledge as a sustainable institutional strategy, not because institutions have become more moral, but because the practical mechanisms for maintaining secrecy have broken down. The archives will eventually be fully opened, either by Vatican decision or by circumstances beyond their control. The only questions are when and whether humanity will be ready for what those documents reveal. But here's what's already clear. We've been told a carefully curated version of history, science, and human potential. The full story, the complete picture, has been kept from us deliberately and systematically. Now that we can see the pattern, now that we understand how information has been controlled and why, we can start asking the right questions. Not just what was hidden, but what that hiding reveals about who we are and what we're capable of becoming. When you read the suppressed texts together, when you connect the forbidden gospels with the lost sciences, the alchemical manuscripts with the miracle archives, the prophetic visions with the exorcism records, a different story emerges. Not the official narrative of humanity as fallen, limited, dependent on institutional mediation for spiritual truth, but something older, stranger, and more empowering. The Gospel of Mary suggests that spiritual authority isn't gendered, that women understood Jesus' teachings as deeply as men, perhaps more deeply. The Gospel of Judas suggests that moral reality is more complex than simple categories of good and evil, that what appears as betrayal might be sacred sacrifice. These texts don't diminish Jesus. They expand the possibilities of how divine truth might be understood and accessed. The ancient scientific texts reveal that knowledge we think of as modern discoveries was actually understood millennia ago. Heliocentrism wasn't invented by Copernicus. It was remembered. Advanced medicine wasn't developed in the Renaissance. It was rediscovered after centuries of deliberate suppression. Roger Bacon didn't predict the future. He claimed to be recovering ancient knowledge from civilizations that rose and fell before recorded history. The alchemical manuscripts describe transformation at every level: matter, consciousness, spirit. They suggest that reality is more malleable than materialist science acknowledges, that focused intention and proper technique can alter physical substances and human awareness. Modern science dismisses this as primitive superstition, but the texts themselves encode genuine chemical knowledge alongside spiritual philosophy. What if the ancients understood something we've forgotten? That matter and consciousness aren't separate categories, but different expressions of the same underlying reality. The miracle archives document impossibilities that occurred under observation, verified by multiple witnesses, examined by skeptical doctors who couldn't explain what they'd seen. Spontaneous healings of terminal illness, regeneration of destroyed organs, reversals of death. The Church investigates these rigorously, precisely because they take the supernatural seriously. What do these records suggest? That human consciousness or divine intervention, or something we don't have words for, can override biological laws under specific conditions. The exorcism records describe encounters with entities that possess knowledge beyond what the human host should have access to. They speak languages never learned. They reveal hidden information. They demonstrate strength that human physiology shouldn't allow. Whether you interpret these as demons, psychological dissociation, or something else entirely, the documentation suggests consciousness isn't as individually bounded as we assume. Even the political documents reveal something important. They show that spiritual institutions have always been entangled with earthly power, that popes negotiated with kings and dictators, that moral authority was wielded as a political weapon. This doesn't necessarily diminish faith. It humanizes the church, shows that divine inspiration flows through flawed institutions operated by people making difficult choices in complex circumstances. What pattern emerges when you read all of this together? Humanity is more capable than we've been told. Women have equal spiritual access and authority, despite centuries of institutional suppression suggesting otherwise. Ancient civilizations possessed sophisticated knowledge that we're only now rediscovering or haven't recovered yet. Consciousness and matter are more fluid, more interconnected than mainstream science acknowledges. The impossible happens regularly, witnessed and documented by skeptical observers, and institutions, even religious ones, shape reality by controlling what we're allowed to know about our own history and potential. This isn't about replacing one dogma with another. It's about recognizing that the official story has always been incomplete, deliberately curated by those with power to maintain that power. The suppressed texts don't provide a single alternative narrative. They provide dozens, contradicting each other, offering different perspectives on the same mysteries. Maybe that's the real threat they pose. Not that they reveal some single forbidden truth, but that they demonstrate truth is more complex, more multifaceted than any institution can contain. The texts suggest we're more powerful than we've been told, not in some New Age sense of unlimited manifestation, but in the straightforward recognition that human beings have capacities, intellectual, spiritual, creative, healing, that institutions have systematically discouraged or suppressed because empowered individuals don't need institutional mediation. Every text they hid tells the same meta-story. You don't need them as much as they need you to believe you need them. Divine truth, if it exists, is accessible directly. Knowledge isn't owned by institutions, but belongs to humanity. The cosmos is stranger, more mysterious, and more full of possibility than official narratives acknowledge. And the evidence for all of this has been sitting in those archives for centuries, hidden from view, waiting for the day when we're ready to reclaim our own story. The Vatican continues to open portions of the archives. They're digitizing documents, releasing files on a controlled timeline, allowing more scholars access under strict conditions. They present this as transparency, as the natural evolution of an institution adapting to modern expectations. And in a sense, that's true. But the deeper truth is that they no longer have us a choice. The era of absolute information control is ending, whether institutions like it or not. Technology drives this change. Digitization makes documents harder to lose and easier to copy. The internet makes information nearly impossible to suppress once it's released. Leaks and whistleblowers can share classified materials globally in seconds. And younger generations, raised with instant access to information, don't grant institutions the same automatic authority that previous generations did. They expect transparency. They demand evidence. They question official narratives reflexively. This shift terrifies traditional institutions. The Church worries that releasing everything would destroy faith, that exposing political compromises and suppressed knowledge would undermine moral authority. But that fear might be misplaced. Institutions that offer genuine value, that serve real human needs, don't collapse when their secrets are revealed. They adapt. They acknowledge mistakes. They become more authentic and, paradoxically, more trusted because of their transparency. If the Vatican released everything tomorrow, every gospel, every scientific text, every political letter, every prophecy, every exorcism record, every miracle investigation, would it destroy Christianity? Some believers would struggle. Some would leave the church, but others would find their faith deepened by complexity, by seeing how divine truth flows through flawed human institutions, by understanding that spirituality is messier and more interesting than sanitized official narratives suggest. The real question isn't whether the archives will eventually be fully opened. They will, either by Vatican decision, by circumstances beyond their control. The real question is whether humanity is ready for that knowledge. And by ready, we don't mean morally prepared or spiritually evolved. We mean practically capable of handling information without wisdom, knowledge without context, truths without the critical thinking to evaluate them properly. We live in an age of unprecedented information access. Anyone with a phone can find instructions for almost anything, learn about almost any topic, encounter perspectives from across the globe. But information without discernment is just noise. We're drowning in data while starving for wisdom, overwhelmed by competing narratives, while lacking the tools to evaluate which are credible. This is the challenge of the coming era. The secrets will come out. Institutions will lose their monopoly on information. The archives will be opened. The classified documents will be leaked. The forbidden knowledge will become accessible. But what then? What do we do with ancient texts that describe technologies we don't understand? With gospels that challenge comfortable interpretations of faith? With political documents that reveal moral complexity, where we wanted simple heroes and villains? With records of impossible events that don't fit any current scientific framework? The era of secret knowledge is ending. The era of wisdom, knowing how to use knowledge, how to evaluate it, how to integrate it without losing our grounding, is just beginning. That's the real transition we're living through, not from ignorance to knowledge, but from controlled information to overwhelming access, with the challenge of developing the discernment to navigate that ocean of data. Maybe that's what the Vatican fears most. Not that releasing the archives would destroy faith or reveal dangerous truths, but that humanity isn't ready for complexity, that we'll misunderstand, misinterpret, weaponize knowledge in ways that cause harm, that we'll lose ourselves in conspiracy theories and alternative narratives without the wisdom to distinguish insight from delusion. There's something to that concern, but it's also patronizing. Humanity has never been ready for transformative knowledge before receiving it. We weren't ready for the printing press, the scientific method, the internet. We stumbled through, made mistakes, eventually developed wisdom after the fact. That's how we grow, not by waiting until we're ready, but by grappling with challenges that force us to become capable. The door stands there still, unmarked and silent. Behind it, 53 miles of shelving hold documents that could reshape our understanding of history, science, spirituality, and human potential. Someday soon, perhaps in this generation, that door will open. Not because the Church decides humanity is finally ready, but because keeping it closed is no longer sustainable. And when it opens, everything might change. Or nothing might change. The documents might confirm our deepest suspicions, or reveal that the truth is more mundane than the mystery. But either way, we'll know. Finally, completely, we'll know. The secrets will come out. They always do. The question is, what will you do with the truth when you finally have it?